consumers see points in a different way to cash, and they evaluate it differently. And so points gives you another lever, basically. You're creating another way of communicating value that changes how consumers buy, but is perceived differently. And so this isn't about, points are great, you have to have a points program. What it's saying is if you have a points program, you get another lever. You make a decision about whether you want it or not. But what's really interesting, almost the larger the discount, the lower the overall spend that you're getting, because consumers are kind of focusing on maximizing the discount. So if you're given like 20% off, they'll spend, a bit more loosely. But if you start saying it's 40 or 50% off, they're spending right to kind of, especially if you've got a spend threshold on it, where it's like, you have to spend over, $100 to get whatever. They'll get as close to that $100 threshold as they can. And so what that roughly translates in my head is that discounts are very transactional. They're very in the moment, and they're making the consumer focus on the cost and the value. And I think that probably also comes at some point where the bigger that discount is, the more they probably think that you're basically taking the mick. Because if you can afford to give me a 50% discount, why were you charging me double earlier? It's because unless you're going out of business, you were basically robbing me blind earlier. And so I think discounts, can be a very challenging thing to play with, where there is a fine line where they work well and drive traffic. But ultimately, they bring in the wrong kind of customer towards the end who doesn't come back and buy more. And equally, I think they send the wrong signal so that customers, just trying to maximize it, but they're not looking to buy anything else. Whereas points were very different. When we did the points tests, points equally drove traffic. You could argue they may have done a little bit more, but that I think that's by the by. What they seem to do though is they get you to focus on the future value of it. So they're not looking at the price, because with points you're still paying full price. You haven't eroded your shelf price. And what we saw was, regardless of the amount of bonus that we gave, they all basically lifted their spend by the same amount. And so almost the points was just a signpost. It was like, hey, look, there's extra value here. If you spend over this amount of money, there's extra value. And so people spent over that money. They spent over by about an X% consistently, regardless of the amount of points we gave. So, what that says to me is it's not points versus discount in the sense of, does it let me save some money, a point's cheaper than a discount. It's that psychologically points are processed differently by the consumer. They treat points differently. Yep. And so you can use that for different behaviors. Discounts are good in some situations, points are good in other situations, but having a points program gives you another pricing lever. That's quite important to understand.